Module 5, Section 1, Safety Manual. Your safety manual has several different chapters to it. Chapter 1 and 2 we covered in Module 4. Chapter 3 we're going to talk about, 4 we're going to talk about, and 5 we're going to talk about a little bit here. For more details on any of these, make sure you look in your training manual. Let's talk about preventing slip and fall accidents. Do you know that slip and falls are the leading cause of death and injury in the workplace, with about 1,500 deaths and 300,000 injuries a year? So 80% of those fall will lose days from work, 12% must be hospitalized. They can cause broken bones, strained muscles, a lot of ouches there. And it's expensive. The average compensation from an employee's fall injury is like $4,700, and the medical expenses are around $2,000. So preventing these is very important. The trips are caused by unseen objects or protrusions such as boxes, wrinkled floor mats, etc. These can best be prevented by proper housekeeping and worker alertness. Remember, we talked about if you're doing an entry rug into a lobby area and you pick it up and you clean underneath it and you vacuum it and you put it down, you need to make sure that those area rugs, from one transition to the other, first the rug is flat and then it's not creating a trip hazard for people coming in. That's a great example. Falls occur when someone moves too far off of his or her center of balance and are often caused by improper use of climbing apparatuses. And a slip, which we're really going to talk about here more often, is defined as a loss of balance caused by too little friction between the feet and the walking surfaces, and slips are the primary concern, as I said, of this discussion. How do we prevent slip and fall accidents? Well, prevention involves an awareness of potential hazards. So you're aware of things that could potentially be a hazard, and you put a plan in place to minimize or reduce that hazard. Preparation means you operate on the assumption that a slip and fall will occur at some time, and you must be ready to defend against the charge of negligence with proper maintenance, record keeping, and make sure you have documentation. So why do people fall? Well, it could be the surface is contaminated. There might be something on there, algae, mold, transitions, as we talked about just a minute ago, from the outside to the inside, or one type of floor surface to another, concrete to marble, concrete to tile, or something goes from dry to wet or wet to dry. They could be failing to pay attention and just bump over something that they didn't see, running or walking too fast, inappropriate footwear. It could be leather soles coming in on a slick surface, or maybe they have some physical limitations. But the most common cause of slippery floors is some unwanted substance on the floor, which can create a hydroplane situation. Something comes between the shoes and the floor, and the friction quality of the floor hardly matters at all at that point, that they may be able to trip. Being aware of the areas that are high risk can help you be prepared for it. Entryways, certainly, as we've talked about, especially on bad weather days. Kitchens, where there's food prep and there might be grease on the floor. Restrooms, showers, again, wet to dry or dry to wet. If there's a leaking pipe. Produce areas of supermarkets where food might slip onto the floor. Certainly healthcare, elder care facilities, health clubs, pool decks. Anywhere that's frequently wet to dry, or if it changes a level or texture, stairs might be a great example. Or, as it relates to us, during damp mopping and floor maintenance. The National Safety Council has come up with a 4-step procedure that may help us do our part in preventing our own slip and falls, and then maybe that can carry over to our customers or visitors to the buildings we clean. Recognize a hazard. Be alert, spot hazards. Don't create them yourself with sloppy work, poor housekeeping. Having your cord stretched across the floor when you're using your vacuum or your floor care machine, or having chemicals that are on the floor that have leaked on the floor without taking care of them. Hazard avoidance, staring around hazards. avoid contaminating the soles of your shoes. If you go through a hazard, slow down. If you're coming from outside to inside and it's wet outside, dry inside, just be careful and be aware of it. Hazard controls, alert others. So put down your wet floor sign to make sure that they're aware of it. Appropriate footwear. So we don't wear leather sole shoes. We're going to wear rubber sole shoes that have some grip to it, some kind of traction. And so avoid shoes that could cause you to have a slip and fall. So the keys to avoiding slip and fall accidents and also defending if there is any lawsuit that should come from it is preventive maintenance and careful documentation. So make sure you're using products that are slip resistant, manufactured by a reputable company that will stand by their products even in court. Products that we provide for you can do that. Likewise, if you chose to get your own products, you want to make sure they're comparable. Make sure you have an effective floor maintenance program so that you can make sure that the floor, if it's getting slippery and there's something we can do about it, we're suggesting that to our customers. Make sure you've trained everybody, test your floors, maintain the floors so they don't have debris on them. If there's repairs that need to be made, then make sure you put that in the logbook to recommend to your customer to do that. As I said just a minute ago, put your wet floor signs down if you see wet floor, or block an area if there's a spill before you can get to it so people don't walk on it. If you can convince your customers to have walk-off mats, that's helpful. And then if anything does happen, keep track of it. You've got your scope of work for your documented cleaning schedule. Make sure you adhere to that. But then just make sure that you're documenting if anything happens. Take pictures where you might need to take pictures if something looks like it's an issue. Let's move on to most frequently asked questions, bloodborne pathogen standards. I've got an asterisk here because I'm only going to highlight on some of the standards here. You're encouraged to go to your manual and review all the questions and answers for bloodborne pathogens. There's a lot to it, but I did want to just highlight a few things here. First and foremost, on December 6, 1991, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which we call OSHA, promulgated or created the bloodborne pathogen standard. The standard is designed to protect workers from the risk of exposures to bloodborne pathogens, such as HIV and hepatitis B. Who does it apply to? It applies to all employees who have occupation exposure to blood or other potentially infectious materials. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Our janitorial staff included. While OSHA does not generally consider all maintenance personnel and janitorial staff employed in non-healthcare facilities to have occupational exposure, it is the employer's responsibility to determine which job classifications or specific tasks and procedures involve occupational exposure. So we err on the side of caution here and safety, and we would rather make you aware of these things. Even if you're not cleaning in a healthcare related facility, you still could come in contact with potential blood. If there's people around, there's a potential for that. So we do want you to be aware of all of the different potential standards. And again, this is just a partial list. What is an exposure control plan? So the exposure control plan is the employer's written program that outlines the protective measures an employer will take to eliminate or minimize exposure to blood and OPIM. Again, I'll go over what that is in a second. How often must that plan be reviewed? The standard does require it to be reviewed annually, so once a year. Or if something changes in tasks, procedures, or employees' positions, then your plan must be reviewed and acted accordingly. What kind of record keeping does OSHA require if there's an incident? So any employer who's required to maintain a log of occupational injuries and illnesses under OSHA's record keeping also is required to maintain a sharps injury log. So if somebody gets a cut from contaminated sharps like needles, that must be a report and the log must be maintained. Which employees must be trained? So all employees with occupational exposure must receive initial and annual training. So what that means is if you are cleaning in a medical facility and you bring in a new employee, you must make sure that they're aware of the sharps, how to deal with sharps, how to deal with bloodborne pathogens as well, so that you're required to do that. Must part-time and temporary employees be trained? Yes, they are also trained, and they also are covered under the OSHA Act, and so they also need to be trained as well. So let's talk a little bit more about the exposure control plan. It was designed, or is designed, to comply with OSHA bloodborne pathogen standard. JanPro has established this exposure control plan to protect all persons who have potential exposure to blood products, or any potentially infectious waste. So an exposure control plan covers all employees, contractors, part-timers participating in the management handling of any biological material. An exposure determination will be conducted for all persons potentially exposed to any of those items. So again, this is a partial list of the exposure control plan. The full information can be found in your manual, but part of being part of our franchise is that you are covered under the JanPro's exposure control plan, and should revisit it with any employee that you have. So let's go through some definitions. So blood means human blood components, products made from human blood. Bloodborne pathogens means pathogenic microorganisms that are present in human blood can cause disease in humans. They're defined as pathogenic microorganisms that are present in human blood can infect and cause disease in people exposed to blood containing the pathogens. So when they speak about blood, it's anything from a human that could cause some type of disease inside someone if they got infected by it. So an exposure plan would also say that work practice controls must be used to eliminate or minimize the exposure. So for example, hand washing facilities must be available where feasible. When it's not feasible, an appropriate antiseptic hand cleanser, a clean cloth, towel, soap and water. Recommends that workers wash their hands immediately or as soon as possible after removal of glove or other protective equipment. And then if mucous membranes have come in contact with blood, the person will flush those areas. So if you inhaled something or got something splashed on your face, and you would then wash with water as soon as possible. The plan and our plan says eating, drinking, smoking, applying cosmetics or lip balm, and handling contact lenses are prohibited in areas where there is a reasonable likelihood of occupational exposure. Food and drink must not be kept in refrigerators, freezers, etc., where blood or other potentially infectious materials are present. When there is a potential for exposure, you must wear personal protective equipment. So if you're working in a healthcare facility, it is not recommended that you apply makeup or lip balm or have a drink while you're in and exposed in that potential area. And then obviously if you've got food and things like that, you need to avoid that. And then, as we always recommend, wear your PPE. So with OSHA, for record keeping purposes, a bloodborne pathogen exposure incident, if you get a needle or a cut or a splash, it's classified as injury if one or all three happen. One, the incident's work related, so you lose consciousness, you have to transfer to another job, or you're restricted, so there needs to be a incident report. Or the incident results in the recommendation of a medical treatment beyond just first aid, so you've got to get blood transfusion or something like that. Or the incident results in diagnosis of seroconversion. That is where they test your blood and they see that an antibody has been created to fight off some type of disease or bacteria that's entered the body. So that if they have presence of that antibody, they're going to assume that there was an exposure incident, and there should be a record keeping for that. So that concludes our bloodborne pathogens portion. Again, I recommend that this is just a partial list, so the full information is in the manual you've been provided. Everything we do here is to highlight areas. Your manual is your resource that you should continue to go to.